Picking up a graphics card that was once selling for close to $2,000 just a couple years ago for only 200 bucks feels pretty awesome. Even now, the RTX 3080 Ti goes for around 500 bucks on eBay. This is the cheapest RTX 3080 Ti that I've seen, and today we're going to be testing it out. I saw a listing on my local classified site for an RTX 3080 Ti for $200. At that price, it definitely felt like it was approaching too good to be true territory. Also, the listing had been up for a couple hours, so I was pretty sure that somebody probably had already gotten to the deal before me, but I decided to text the seller anyways and sent them a message. Turns out they replied pretty quickly and told me that the card was available. I told them I could come get the card that night, but they told me that the next day would work better for them, so I agreed to meet up with them the next day. I kind of thought that somebody would snipe the card out from under me, maybe offering the seller more money for the card or something like that. But surprisingly, I picked up the card next day without any issue. Even after picking up the card, I was trying not to get my hopes up too much, just because I still kind of felt like it was too good to be true. I was kind of nervous, maybe they ripped me off and it didn't work or something like that. But when I got home and plugged it into the test bench, everything seemed to work fine. I didn't have the opportunity to fully test it just because there's a water block on it. The card actually came with a water block, so I don't have a water cooling setup, and so I couldn't really put it through its paces yet. Luckily, the seller had the original air cooler, and they gave me that as well. When I sat down to reinstall the air cooler, I found out that the screws on the water block weren't actually compatible with the air cooler. I was pretty sure that they would be. So anyways, after doing some Googling, I ordered some screws hoping that they would work. It was weirdly hard to find any information on the screw size for this backplate and GPU cooler. Luckily, I ended up getting the correct screws the first try. I replaced the thermal paste on the GPU die, and then I replaced a few different sections of the thermal pads, but most of it was still in pretty good condition, so I just kind of kept that. I got it all back together, and it was looking pretty close to new, honestly. Before running any games, I did run Unigine Heaven for a bit just to see if the card was stable and actually working, and to my surprise a little bit, it worked without issue. There wasn't any artifacting, the card didn't power down or anything like that. It seemed to be running just fine. So with that, let's get into testing some games on this GPU. For the benchmarking system, I have my trusty Ryzen 7 5800X 3D CPU. Not the newest, but still holds its own compared to newer generations of CPU. For the RAM, I'm running 32 gigabytes of DDR4, 4000 megahertz CL20 RAM, and then the games are all running on a PCIe Gen 4 2TB SSD. And then the motherboard I'm using is a Gigabyte Aorus ITX motherboard. Also, just a heads up, I tested most of these games at 1080p. I'm still rocking that resolution for gaming, so that's what I'm mostly interested in. But I did throw in a couple 1440p benchmarks just out of curiosity. Starting with the first game we're taking a look at, in Red Dead Redemption 2, in the built-in benchmark at 1080p max settings, I saw an average of 121 FPS with minimums in the high 50s. Running the benchmark at 1440p, I saw the average drop down to about 102 FPS with minimums in the 60s. I ran this benchmark a couple times because that seemed a little bit off, but for some reason the lows were slightly higher at 1440p. The minimums did seem to vary a lot, so it did jump around test to test, but those were the most consistent numbers that I saw. Next up, I tested Final Fantasy 16 at 1080p high settings. I saw an average that sat in the 120s with 1% lows in the 100s. The fight that I tested was near the beginning of the game, so it might not perform as well in later fights. Next I have Overwatch 2. Typically for Overwatch, I immediately turn all the settings down to low. It defaulted to ultra settings when I opened the game, so I decided to test that. There was a bit of variance depending on the map and the game, but at 1080p Ultra I saw averages that sat in the 300s, and then the lows were in the mid 200s to 300s. At 1440p, I saw an average that sat in the 240s, and then with 1% lows that were around 180. Next up, testing Hunt Showdown. This game varied a bit depending on the map and location of testing, but the averages at 1080p low settings sat in the 220s, with 1% lows ranging from about 120 to 160, just depending on the exact map that you were on and the compound within that map. Testing 1440p low settings, the average ranged from about 150 to 170 FPS, with lows in the 110s to 130s. There was also a recent update that was supposed to optimize the game a bit more as far as performance goes, so I might have to do a bit more testing on that. So next up we have Helldivers. I haven't played this game in a while, and I forgot most of the controls, and the first game I loaded into, I accidentally added a teammate, and then immediately chucked a grenade at them and blew them up. So that was kind of fun, but luckily they were pretty chill about it. But yeah, I tested this at 1080p high settings and got an average of 120 FPS with 1% lows that sat around 104. Moving on to the next game, I tested Fortnite. And as always, the first few games were a bit choppy, especially when dropping in. The 1% lows were in the single digits sometimes, but after a few minutes and a few games, that smoothed out for the most part. On DX12 high settings, I saw averages in the 90s to 100s, and then 1% lows in the 50s to 60s, outside of some of those major stutters. It also tested out performance mode, and the averages were really high, sitting in the mid to high 400s. The 1% lows for the most part sat in the 90s, but with some of that stuttering, it did drop down to the 30s every so often as well. I'm still not sure what it is about Fortnite, but it always kind of performs like this. It's always like really choppy in the first few games that I play, and then it kind of smooths out after that. It's weird because looking at the numbers, most of the time, it feels pretty smooth to me when playing, but then I look at these numbers and I'm like, wow, the 1% lows are pretty terrible, especially compared to other games. So I'm not sure how that works, but those are the numbers I'm seeing. Lastly, I tested Black Ops 6 using the in-game benchmark, and at 1080p balance settings, I saw an average around 160 with 1% lows in the 130s, and then at 1440p, the average dropped to about 130 with lows in the 100s. At 200 bucks, this was honestly a steal. This is definitely one of the best bang for buck GPUs I've ever picked up. It comes with modern GPU tech and holds up well compared to newer generations of Nvidia and AMD cards. I'm probably going to be using this in a PC build that I have coming up, so if there's any interest in that, definitely get subscribed to see that.